First of all, I loved the scope of what you were talking about because it really took us from the point of view of thinking about this at an individual level and actually thinking about it at an industry and business level. And as you mentioned, this is one of the things that our university is trying to think deeply about. And so the first thing I want to do is just think very broadly. I'm a business school dean and a China scholar by training. And I worry about this issue in terms of the tension between globalization, and when I think about globalization, I think about open borders and how we think about facilitating the flow of capital and how we think about just how our economy can be at the center of what's going on in the global economy. And then security, which is really about, in some ways, protecting our borders and making sure that I don't mean secrets in a negative way, but all of the things that protect us at the end of the day. And as you mentioned in your comments, the information age, there's so much flowing. So how do we balance that tension? How do we think about that? It's a very hard tension and so I'd love to hear.
There is a natural tension. The worst thing in the world you can do is to decide to go live in a closet because you can't stand the complexity of the threat around you. Globalization is an imperative. It's an imperative for American businesses. It's an imperative for businesses all over the world. That's the way the economy is operating today. That represents the source of growth. It represents the source of economic security for our country, ultimately. And it's not going to do us a lot of good if our networks are perfectly safe, but we have no economic security. So globalization is something that we have to not only acknowledge, we have to embrace it and figure out how to make it the most effective. So I don't see it as a question of either or. I think it's a matter of how we make it work. And there's an analogy that many have used when talking about cybersecurity that I think is actually a pretty good analogy here. And the analogy is the one of the human body. You know, we all have many viruses and germs and bugs running around inside of us all the time. And yet we have figured out how to not only live but thrive in that environment. We don't fear going and exploring a new place where we've never been before because of what might get us. There is a perspective around embracing the fact that you live every day in a threat environment of some kind, even within your own body. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way we need to think about our network security. We have to operate inside a living threat environment, and we have to embrace that and incorporate that into our thinking around how we do that. And businesses have to do that as well in a very thoughtful way because it's a natural viewpoint within businesses oftentimes to say, all right, we're going to figure out exactly how to defend our network and we're going to put a lot of investment in that and rely on that completely. I think we're evolving to a place where businesses are having to think more carefully about what do you actually put on the network and how do you make that actually work from a broader network security perspective.
So it's an interesting idea. Does that, in your view, actually lead us down the road to more innovation? I mean, if you have to push companies to think more carefully about what the systems, I mean.
Absolutely it does. It forces companies to think differently. In fact, I think it's a very healthy process in many respects because it makes you think not just about your network, it makes you think about your business. And what is it that is ultimately of extraordinary value to you? You know, I will say that many businesses for a long time have sort of taken it on face value that if you develop intellectual property, then it's really yours and you can rely on that ownership. Mm-hmm. And you have to think carefully about that. That's changing in the world that we're in, and it's changed in a lot of business models, and you've seen it with the business model in the music industry. Right, in terms of how that plays out.
Interesting.
And I think we're going to be seeing that thought process change more globally.
Yeah. So I want to take that a little bit further and think about issues like national security. So you have globalization in business, and then as the overlay or the kind of protectorate of that, you also have issues like how a country defines its boundaries and actually helps build that balance. And here I have to just kind of say as a as a China scholar that gets brought into these conversations sometimes. Sometimes I'll find myself in a conversation with somebody who will be, privy to information that I don't have, and they'll say, well, I can't really tell you what's going on, but like we know, that there's stuff that you don't know, which I'd take, like I'm just a civilian, so I don't really know like a lot of things that are going on in these conversations, but I'm interested in this balance between transparency on the one hand, and as you mentioned in your comments, some of the things that we pride ourselves on are kind of the democratic process and freedom of information and the flow of information, and that's maybe in some ways what has made our economy robust in these flows. But I'm interested in the tension between that transparency and the necessities of control. Like sometimes it's necessary for a government to step in and say, like, we got this. And so I'm kind of curious, like, how do you think of that balance?
Yeah. I think there's always a tension, when it comes to cybersecurity. There's always the tension in any form of a realm such as this, where you have techniques and methods for gaining information that you don't want to put at risk by what you say about that information. So you always have to navigate your way through that. But I would liken this one more to the perspective that many companies use to encourage internal reporting of problems. We have in our company an open line system, and we encourage our employees to call if there's a problem going on, and we make a commitment to keeping that private. So that's a little different level of engagement than a classified matter. But what we do is every 6 months or so, we put out a publication in our company that says, and we don't identify anybody by name, but it says how many incidences of what type resulted from open line reporting. And so we create a transparency around a process whose integrity relies on privacy.
Interesting.
And there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that in what we're talking about now. Part of it is just a broader public information or understanding and communication around what exactly are we talking about. Because I said in my remarks, most people, I think, when you encounter them and talk about cybersecurity, they're thinking identity theft, they're thinking about my credit card, my social security number, those types of things. But elevating the discussion across our country around what we really mean by cybersecurity, so that when we begin talking about the things that we want to be more transparent on, there's actually a context for that conversation.
So on one level, we have to elevate the conversation from individuals to the corporate level of, say, like, what does it mean that financial records are flowing across? But on the second level, it seems that you're talking about a parallel process in which we can really think about how to be transparent, but transparent at a macro level.
And protect the privacy.
Interesting. That's great. Okay, I would be disappointed in myself, and I'm sure others that know me would be disappointed if I didn't ask a question about China, so I hope you'll allow this. But I'm actually interested in not the sort of standard question about China, which is, usually the Huawei and all of these kinds of things. I'm actually interested in a different issue, which is that in some ways I think China's success has been really driven by a decentralized process. They created competition amongst the localities. They kind of developed a very decentralized system. And in some ways, we actually often code China as being this state-driven authoritarian economy that is surely, like every time there's a cybersecurity attack, it's coming from Beijing. But the reality is it may be coming from some group of 50 people working off in Xi'an or Xinjiang province or who knows where. And how do you then distinguish, okay, of course you have a cybersecurity threat and you need to defend against it, but how do you deal with the balance of coding that as a China threat versus a private sector threat versus it just gets very complex at this point to trace these things back, and I'm just very curious.
It is extraordinarily complex. And I would agree with you. I think we oftentimes code China for the broad problem, and China is not the only country that has this set of issues that emanate from within its borders. There are a number of countries that represent that sort of issue. But yet I think it's oftentimes, again, I go back to taking the complex and making it understandable. This is part of the language that has developed around cybersecurity because everyone sort of expects that that's what's going on. I think in part because of the history of intellectual property issues in China for so many years that the government did not deal with, ultimately began to engage on it, dealt with it in a way that many companies feel more comfortable today with that. But I think that is out there in the popular understanding of kind of the history of how China dealt with a particular issue, and so it perhaps makes it easier to cast China as the primary source of concern. So from my perspective, number one, it's not only China that we have to worry about. Okay. If you're doing business anywhere around the globe, you better be worried about it. And number two, within China, China's, as you point out, is not a monolith. There are all different aspects of the society in China and different organizations within China. Now, I would say that we probably see coming from China a little bit more state-sponsored activity than we do other places. And so there, I think that aspect of it is probably fair. But I completely agree with you. Painting the entire country with one broad stroke would be a very, very limited view of the reality.
And does the cybersecurity industry have the mechanisms internally to figure out what is state-sponsored versus what is, or is that?
It's a complex challenge.
Yeah.
I would say that there's opportunity for continuous innovation there.
To go back to our first point. Good. So this next question ties into a little bit your role as an expert in this industry. And I'm just in some ways fascinated by the evolution of the internet. I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize or remember that the internet was formed. I mean, its predecessor was something called DARPANET that was formed in the 1950s, right? That was set up as distributed networks in order to decentralize information, right? Like the whole point was if there was some kind of attack on our information infrastructure, what would we do? And, oh, you should have this system that you can't pin down. So in some ways, the entire logic of that system has actually led to our inability to actually defend the system. And so, as somebody who thinks about this industry all the time,
No, it's an amazing legacy and development over time. If you look back at the mindset around defense in the 1950s, it was more around physical security, right? And the idea that you could have a network where you could distribute information nodes and distribute information storage inherently looked more secure, right? Because if one place got taken out, you've got it backed up, you can access it, however you want to think about it. So the notion of distributed physical security is still an important concept and something that really underpinned the notion of distributing things, plus, of course, just the natural ability to share information more broadly in the defense architecture made a lot of sense. But the concept around DARPANET never focused around designing a network for information security. It was not inherent in the original design. And so to a large extent, we are today operating with an internet not designed for network security. So it has baked into it enormous levels of vulnerability. And there are a lot of folks who would love to call time out and say, we've gone far enough with this. Let's start creating Internet 2 or 5 or however you'd want to describe it that's designed with network security in mind. Now, we'd all love to do that. It'd be a great thing, but think about infrastructure development costs and replacement costs. It's a good debate, but I don't see a lot of momentum in that direction quite yet. But it's actually something that's being studied in a number of places, including a number of the universities that are developing protocols and approaches to having an inherently secure network approach.
So the first thing that's interesting there for me is I actually didn't understand that piece of the history. I thought that it was all developed about distributed knowledge networks, but that... But the second thing that's very interesting, having spent a lot of time in China and seeing what it means to actually operate in a state that can shut down the network.
Oh, yeah.
As an American who prizes freedom, I don't want to be a part of that. I want the flow of information, right? I want the choice. And so
Makes us better.
Yeah, and so it goes back to the initial point that you were bringing up in your talk, that these are the things that make us strong as a democracy.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, they are the things that make us vulnerable. And so how do we... that's a tough set of issues. So without further ado, let me then kind of use that as a segue to throw it open to our audience, if you're willing,
Absolutely.
because I think that these are really exciting topics and questions, and I'm just so thrilled that we get to explore them with you. and I know the audience wants to too. So I see someone in the back here that we'll start with.
Hi, I'm Eric Engelman from Bloomberg News. Question on the legislation. You talked about the importance of information sharing. How do you feel about a bill that's one of the central pieces of cybersecurity legislation out there, the Lieberman-Collins bill, which envisions giving the Department of Homeland Security the ability to set standards for companies around cybersecurity? Second question was, has your company been compromised by hacker attacks or malware?
Well, on the first point, let me comment with respect to the Senate bill. And there are a number of pieces of legislation that are out there, so that's not the only one, although it's one that I think has gotten a lot of attention very appropriately for the amount of thinking that's gone into the construction of the bill. I think the bill has a lot of strong attributes. It goes a long way towards the information sharing construct that I was describing. And what I do like about it is that it doesn't just simply hand everything over to DHS. It creates a mechanism for DHS to actually work with industry to come up with the right approaches to getting things done. And that's ultimately what we need. We need these partnerships because, quite frankly, I think it's almost impossible for anyone sitting on one side of the table to come up with the right construct for getting things done. We learned a lot doing this defense industrial base pilot. And every industry that goes through that, if we think about the critical infrastructure industries, they're going to learn some things that they didn't expect before doing the pilot. So we need to have that sort of partnership approach. As painful as it is to actually run some of these pilots, we need to have that partnership approach to learn so that then we can create the environment that DHS can use to set standards. And I do think standard setting ultimately is going to be a positive thing. As I remarked in my comments earlier, it's not often you hear someone from business saying, well, let's set some more standards. But setting standards actually helps because if you're a company that's not an expert in cybersecurity, you don't want to make a big investment to get protected and find out 6 weeks later you missed because you thought this is what you were supposed to be doing, but you didn't quite get it right. And the development of standards actually helps investment get focused in a direction where people can say we are doing the right things and we can represent that we have a solid underpinning for the actions that we're taking. Because for many businesses, this is not a small investment that we're talking about. This can represent a very substantial fraction of their IT budgets. So I think the notion of having DHS involved with industries in a partnership approach to ultimately lead to standard setting, I think that's the right idea. So it's an important track. Your second question, we're all under attack every day, every minute, every second if I pay attention to our IT organization. And so, yes, we're all under attack. And that's about as far as I'll go with that.
I just have to say before we go to the next question, it actually heartens me to hear you talk about the coordination between government and industry, because I think the tired debate between, markets are wholly efficient and governments are wholly inefficient, I think that the only way to actually building a responsible capitalist economy is to actually have that kind of coordination. So I love that comment. Next question. Okay, so gentleman right here.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Which things are best done by companies themselves and which are best done by companies working together and which are best done with the government?
Yeah, ultimately, I think a company has to have the autonomy to really monitor its own networks and to take action on its own networks. And so, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, we need to have some clarity in the legislation that removes impediments to that. And it's certainly something a company can choose to outsource to another party to actually do that work on their own networks. So that's an important part of it. When you take it up, though, in terms of the interactions, we do need to make sure that it's just perfectly fine from a legal standpoint for companies to share information with each other to affect cybersecurity. And that might, again, sound like, why not? That's an easy thing to do. Most good companies think long and hard before sharing information with other companies from an antitrust perspective, right? So if these are two companies in the same industry, particularly if it's an industry like many of our critical infrastructure industries, where there aren't that many companies doing a particular thing, we're all very sensitive to even giving the impression that we're stepping anywhere near the edge of antitrust or a number of other legal matters. And having clarity around the actions that companies can take from a legal perspective would really help on the information sharing side. I think that's absolutely imperative for us to be able to take a step forward on this. I will tell you, we probably had a leg up on that in the defense industrial base pilot, because companies in the defense industrial base have to work together rather intimately for the nation to be successful in implementing the types of defense products that we do for the Department of Defense. It's rare that you find any weapon system that's done by one company. It's done by several companies all working together, generally one prime contractor and others working with them. And so we have, over the years, created ways of working together that have ensured that we don't run up against the edge of antitrust regulations and the rest. Not every industry has that history and that familiarity with making things work effectively by working together. And so I think as we conduct more of these pilots, we're going to find, in some cases, more cultural issues than actual legal issues. But we've got to actually get underway and do that so that we can sort out where those barriers are in information sharing. Ultimately, I do think government has a big role to play. Government has at its disposal the broadest ability to conduct situational awareness of what's going on around the globe and to share, as appropriate, that information with companies that could be put at risk by whatever the government is saying. There, too, we need to make sure that the legislation, however it evolves, provides a very fluid and straightforward mechanism for government to share information with business and for business to share information with government. When we ran the DIB pilot, that turned out to be, I would say, the hardest part of it was information sharing between government and industry, not between company and company. So there are a lot of impediments that we've got to work our way through, and all of those are critical to make this work.
So I want to go to our trustee, Rick Knopp, here.
Rick Knopp, trustee. Do you think the movement to cloud computing is going to create more or less cybersecurity? I know that many of the intelligence agencies, the NSA and the CIA, are moving to cloud computing. And I know there's a debate whether that either lessens cybersecurity or creates more cybersecurity.
Yeah, ultimately, I think the move to cloud computing it's another thing like sort of globalization. It's something that the economic forces are going to be so compelling that we see a tremendous step in that direction. And taken on its own, if you just take the basic concept of cloud computing all by itself, it's rather easy to conclude that that's far more vulnerable. But we're not just taking it on its own. And in fact, as the many departments of government are thinking their way through cloud computing, those that are thinking about it, I would say the right way, are the ones that are including the perspective of cyber in their upfront architecture. So just as my earlier comments about the internet apply, I think the same thing can be applied to cloud computing. If we design it up front from a security perspective with that in mind, I think we can be far more successful in defending it.
All right, I'm going to go to one last question over here, Steve Schooner, and then I want to make sure I don't ignore this side of the room. I apologize, but we'll get to you.
Thank you. Steve Scooter from over at the Government Procurement Law Program at the law school. Money's awfully tight right now, so I'll give you an open-ended question on the defense industrial base. The bottom line is, what's ahead for the defense contractors? Can we maintain technical superiority? And frankly, does the modern United States government really understand how to buy innovation?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Wish I had the answers to that one. You always ask the hardest questions. I've noticed that. From a broad perspective, clearly with the pressures that we're seeing in the budget environment, protecting innovation is going to be an imperative, an absolute imperative. As much as many of us like to talk about the issues in government procurement, I have to say that despite all of the issues and sometimes the bureaucracy that you struggle your way through, the government across the board, Department of Defense, the intelligence communities, probably has fostered more innovation than just about any other aspect, single stovepipe aspect of our society. And we could debate long and hard why that is. Sometimes it's about economic incentives, but more often it's about the perspective of the value of what gets created and the eagerness of the individuals who work in those enterprises to do something that matters. We have a lot of innovators in our company that don't spend their time innovating because they think they're going to get a great bonus check next year. They innovate because what they do matters. And it perhaps sounds a little bit idealistic, but it's true. So we need to make sure that stays an important part of the prospect. The other thing that I would point out, and this is kind of an interesting perspective as well, it's oftentimes during the downturns in the overall spending environment that you see the most innovation. In fact, good companies use downturn environments to drive innovation so that when you come back up the other side, you're better positioned to grow. So if you turn the clock back and look back over the downturns in the defense environment, what did we get? In the 1960s, early 1960s, we got a lot of innovation that created space. If you look at what happened in the downturn after the Vietnam War in the 70s, we got stealth. There were a lot of things that came out of the downturn in the 90s, including a lot of the innovation that we're realizing today around cybersecurity, because there were a lot of folks spending their time in the 90s thinking about where things were going to go. So I'm not pessimistic about innovation. I think we have an extraordinary capacity for it. I think there are some very fundamental drivers that create it. And so I'm optimistic about the outlook for innovation.
But it's an important message, because innovation doesn't just come from private entrepreneurship in which you have somebody in a garage developing things. It actually comes from government investment.
That's a great thing, though, about our economy. There's so many different sources of real innovation.
Over here, I've been ignoring you guys. Any questions from this side of the room? Yes, please, sir.
Thanks. Mike Barrett, I'm also a defense consultant. But my question was actually more about the issue of cybersecurity when it comes to the tragedy of the commons. So you have these folks such as yourselves who run large companies and they're willing to spend a lot on it, but then we're all only as strong as the weakest link.
Absolutely.
And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time concerned about our supply chain, and know that many of our vulnerabilities, not just cybersecurity, but other vulnerabilities, emanate from our supply chain. It's part of the reason that I think ultimately these pilots that I've been talking about and a partnership approach really has a lot of value, because as you point out, smaller enterprises don't have the capacity to make the big investments, much less make the big investments time and time and time again. So as we go through this next set of activities, I think we'll find a different receptivity amongst members of the supply chain to be engaged in this. Part of it because they're going to have to, but part of it because we'll create a construct that makes it economical.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Somebody over here, right here. Yes, sir.
Hello, Mr. Bush. Thank you for being with us today. I'm a sophomore in the business school, and obviously you have our respect being CEO of such an important company, as well as being on the forefront of cybersecurity defense. So my question is, what advice would you give my classmates and myself if we want to get into defense contracting, and if we want to get into the complex issues relating to government business and cybersecurity?
I think there are several aspects to it. One of them, though, is something I mentioned in the talk and have referenced a few times here. Individuals that bring a broad perspective as we deal with more and more complex issues are individuals that bring more value to the discussion. So the opportunity to engage in interdisciplinary perspectives on things like cybersecurity, and I can pick many of the different things that we're involved in as a company, folks who can bring that broader view make a big impact. And so I would encourage you to take full advantage of an institution like George Washington University that not only offers you that opportunity, but also bakes it into the way the university thinks about what's good. So that's sort of first and foremost in terms of what you can do now to prepare yourself to engage in it. The other thing I would say is bring real passion for it. When we think about the employees in our company, that's a big part of it. If you're on the team, you're really on the team.
I have to say one more time before we take the final question, I'm so excited to hear you say these things, because we talk about these issues with our business students all the time, and in particular with undergrads. They're often saying, well, should I triple major in finance, economics, and accounting? And the answer is like, do what you're passionate about, but then get out into the university and learn something we hear it time and again from recruiters that you want to be talking to people who are passionate and interesting. And last question, sir, please.
Good evening. Good evening. Adam Mattina. I'm a business student and information security professional. My question is, I'd be interested to hear maybe just a brief story about some of those more unusual perspectives from the NIAC, and if you see our industry, if ever, moving away from fear, uncertainty, and doubt as a value proposition and onto something a little bit more meaningful and business driving.
Mm-hmm. Well, every company that I've interacted with from the NIAC perspective, you start with, oftentimes when it comes to something like information security or cybersecurity, you start actually with very little knowledge across most of the industrial landscape around what it really means, what we're really talking about. And so once you go from little knowledge to lots of knowledge, that's when you get to the fear part of it. Because like most things, when you learn something you don't know and it's not good, your first reaction is, uh-oh, this is awful. But the discussion rapidly transitions from that into business. And as I said earlier, businesses have been a little bit stymied on making progress on information security for a little bit of a concern, a big concern, I should say, over how do we really do this from a cost-effective standpoint? How do we make investments that we know, number one, will pay off, that actually get a return on the investment? Most of the companies we're talking about here are publicly traded companies, and even private companies care a lot about getting return on investment. So you have to be able to translate the discussion into business terms pretty quickly. And to calculate a return, you need to calculate either what you're going to gain or what you're not going to lose, right? So those are the types of discussions that we actually get to fairly quickly with most enterprises that are learning their way into thinking about information security on a different level than they had previously. But it's going to come down to the business principles. Because if you're simply telling someone they have to do it, you'll get minimal compliance. If you're helping them understand the why, then you're going to get the level of investment that I think is appropriate to address this issue.
Wonderful. Mr. Bush, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful thing.